The prison compound sat in the middle of an alien wasteland, its high walls pulsing with a dull blue energy. Beyond the perimeter, jagged cliffs and toxic winds made escape impossible. The Drevlock, a ruthless war-driven species, had captured the last remnants of Earth's finest engineers after a failed diplomatic meeting. Jack sat on the cold metal floor, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He and his team weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for war. But they had something far more dangerous than brute force, human ingenuity. A Drevlock guard stomped past, its armor hissing with pressurized gas. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, his fingers tightened around the tiny scrap of material hidden in his sleeve, a dull, brittle shard of something he couldn't quite explain. It had been left behind after a Drevlock patrol passed through the area, and while the aliens dismissed it as worthless, Jack had a feeling they were wrong. He turned to David, an older engineer with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. "This stuff," Jack whispered, showing him the shard. "It reacts to energy. I saw it glow when their patrol passed by." David squinted, taking the piece carefully. "You sure?" Jack nodded. "We need to test it." They waited until nightfall. Under the dim glow of the prison lights, Jack pulled out a small, broken Drevlock device he had salvaged from a guard's discarded gear. It still held a weak charge. With a flick, he directed a faint pulse of energy at the shard. The effect was immediate. The shard shimmered, then pulsed with an eerie, golden glow. A low hum filled the air, making the hairs on Jack's arms stand up. The energy seemed to bend around the material, amplifying before vanishing in a sudden crack of displaced air. David's eyes widened. "That's not normal." Jack smirked. "No, it's not." The two men exchanged glances. If this material could absorb and redirect energy, it meant one thing. They had just found a weapon. Cliffhanger ending. Jack clenched his fist around the shard. "They have no idea what we're about to do." Jack and David worked in silence, their hands moving quickly under the dim lighting of their cramped cell. The other prisoners, engineers, scientists, and technicians, were asleep, oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. Jack held the strange shard up to the weak glow of a stolen Drevlock energy cell. The moment the energy pulsed toward it, the shard shimmered, absorbing the pulse instantly before releasing it in a sharp, nearly invisible ripple. David pulled his hand back just in time. "That could have taken my fingers off." Jack exhaled, his mind racing. "This isn't just reacting to energy, David. It's redirecting it." David's face hardened. "That means it's usable." They had seen Drevlock weapons in action. Plasma-based, high-energy discharge rifles that could burn through steel. If this material could absorb and redirect energy, it could neutralize those weapons, or even turn them against their users. Jack's heart pounded. "We need more of this stuff." David nodded grimly. "That means we need to get out of this cell." The first test. The next day, they kept their eyes open as they were marched from their cells to the central worksite, where humans were forced to repair damaged Drevlock machinery. The massive alien guards patrolled lazily, assuming their captives were too weak and broken to fight back. Jack spotted it, the same strange material embedded in the metallic floor of the compound. It wasn't just a discarded piece, this planet was full of it. The Drevlock had no idea they were standing on the most powerful weapon they had ever seen. Under the watchful eye of the guards, Jack crouched near a section of the floor, pretending to inspect the worn-out wiring of a Drevlock transport vehicle. With careful fingers, he pried a small chunk of the material loose. A sharp grunt made him freeze. One of the Drevlock guards had stopped a few feet away, its glowing red eyes locked onto him. Jack forced himself to stay calm. "The circuits are fried," he said, gesturing toward the wires. "If we don't replace them, the whole system will short." The alien stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low growl and walked away. Jack exhaled, feeling the weight of the shard in his pocket. He had it. Now, they could run their first real test. The close call. That night, Jack, David, and two others, Michael and Ben, huddled in the corner of their cell. The lights had dimmed, signaling the end of the work shift, but no one would be sleeping tonight. Jack placed the new shard on the floor. "All right," he whispered, taking out the small Drevlock power cell. "Let's see what this can really do." He activated the energy pulse. The reaction was instant. The shard flared with an unnatural golden light, absorbing the energy like before. But this time, instead of harmlessly dissipating, the energy concentrated into a fine, controlled beam that shot forward, melting a hole in the metal wall behind them. Michael clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. "That's a weapon," he whispered. David nodded. "A damn good one." Jack felt his pulse quicken. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were rebels. A sudden noise made them freeze. Heavy Drevlock footsteps. One of the guards was patrolling past their cell. If they had seen that flash of energy, they were dead. Jack lunged forward and covered the shard with his sleeve, blocking the glow. The footsteps slowed. The guard stopped right outside their cell. The four men held their breath. The Drevlock let out a snort, then moved on. Ben released a shaky breath. That was too close. Jack stared down at the shard in his hands. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. But it was their only chance. "We're going to use this," he said, voice firm. "And we're getting out of here." David nodded. "Then we need a plan." Jack's grip tightened around the shard. "We don't just have a plan. We have a weapon." Jack could feel the shard in his pocket, its smooth surface warm from absorbing energy. Every instinct in his body told him that what they were about to do was insane. But there was no turning back now. The Drevlock had enslaved them, underestimated them, and discarded them as weak. Tonight, they were going to prove them wrong. The plan. The four men huddled together in their cell, whispering. The plan was simple, but risky. Michael and Ben would cause a distraction in the eastern sector by sabotaging the power grid. The Drevlock relied on their high-tech force fields. If they lost power, their entire security system would be vulnerable. Jack and David would use the newly discovered weapon to disable the first wave of guards, clearing a path for the prisoners to escape. Once outside the compound, they would head for the abandoned Drevlock transport ships, hoping to steal one before reinforcements arrived. The odds were against them, but if they waited any longer, they'd never get another chance. Jack exhaled. "We do this fast, we do this smart. We get out alive." David smirked. "And if we don't?" Jack glanced down at the shard, watching the golden energy pulse faintly in his palm. "Then we take as many of them with us as we can." The distraction. The night shift was just beginning. Drevlock guards stood lazily at their posts, their massive plasma rifles slung across their backs. Michael and Ben slipped away first, moving toward the power grid near the compound's main generator. They carried nothing but a handful of stolen Drevlock tools and a broken circuit board, hoping to blend in as workers. A few tense minutes passed. Then, boom! The entire eastern sector plunged into darkness. Sparks rained down from the high walls as circuits overloaded and exploded, sending alien workers scattering. Screeches and guttural shouts filled the air as the Drevlock scrambled to fix the power failure. That was their cue. Jack pulled out the shard, gripping it tightly. "Let's go." The first attack. Jack and David sprinted through the shadows, hugging the walls as they approached the nearest guard post. Two Drevlock warriors stood there, their glowing red eyes scanning the chaos in the distance. Their plasma rifles hummed softly, charged and ready. Jack stepped into the open. The guards turned, startled. Jack unleashed the weapon. The shard flared, absorbing the ambient energy in the air before releasing it in a focused, blinding beam of golden light. The energy tore through the Drevlock's armor, melting it like wax under a flame. The first guard collapsed instantly, his body crumbling into glowing embers. The second let out a horrified screech, fumbling for his rifle. But before he could react, Jack fired again, the beam piercing through his chest. Silence. David exhaled. Holy hell. Jack clenched his fist, feeling the lingering heat from the shard. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an unstoppable force. For the first time since being captured, they weren't the ones running. They were fighting back. The escape begins. Michael and Ben met up with them near the western gate, panting from the run. The power's still down, Michael whispered. We have a window, but not for long. Jack nodded. Then we move, now. The four men ran across the open yard, heading for the Drevlock transport bay. Alarms blared across the compound, and more Drevlock soldiers poured out of the barracks, weapons raised. Jack turned and fired again, sending searing beams of golden light into the nearest group of guards. Their armor cracked and disintegrated, their weapons exploding in their hands. But there were too many of them. David grabbed Jack's shoulder. We can't fight them all. We have to get to the ship. Jack cursed under his breath, then nodded. They ran. The Drevlock gave chase, firing wild plasma shots as the humans ducked and weaved through the maze of structures. Then, just ahead, the transport bay. Jack could see a sleek, black Drevlock warship, its entrance ramp still down. If they could make it inside, they had a chance. But then, a massive Drevlock warlord stepped into their path. Towering over them, his armor thicker than any they had seen before, he let out a low growl. His plasma blade ignited, casting an eerie blue glow across the yard. Jack gritted his teeth, gripping the shard in his palm. This was it. Fight or die. Jack's heart raced. The massive Drevlock warlord, his towering form casting a shadow over the four humans, raised his plasma blade high, crackling with lethal energy. His eyes glowed like embers, burning with unrelenting anger. You dare defy me? The warlord's voice was deep, thunderous. I'll crush you all. Jack's grip tightened around the shard. His fingers were cold with sweat, but there was no time for fear. They had come too far to be stopped now. Get ready. Jack shouted. The first move. The warlord charged first, his massive form moving with surprising speed. The blade in his hand sliced through the air, and Jack barely managed to dodge. He wasn't used to being in the open like this, especially not against a creature that strong. But there was no choice. David raised his hand, preparing to unleash a burst from the shard, but the warlord was faster. He swiped his blade through the air, sending out a shockwave of energy that sent David flying back against a metal wall. David! Michael shouted, but there was no time to check on him. Jack's mind raced. They couldn't just keep dodging. They needed a way to fight back, and fast. A change of tactics. Ben took the lead, charging toward the warlord with a stolen Drevlock plasma rifle. He fired a shot, but the warlord barely flinched. The blast ricocheted off his armor. Jack's eyes darted around, searching for a weakness, a flaw in the Drevlock's armor. He remembered something from earlier, the material. It had absorbed and reflected energy, but could it affect the warlord's technology? Suddenly, Jack had an idea. Ben, cover me. Jack yelled. He lunged toward the warlord, who swung his plasma blade again, narrowly missing. Jack held the shard in front of him, aiming it toward the warlord's exposed chest plate. The golden glow from the shard flared to life as Jack unleashed everything it had. The beam shot forward, striking the warlord's armor with a blinding flash of light. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The beam bent the energy around the warlord, tearing through his armor and disrupting his power systems. The warlord's weapon flickered and sputtered before it short-circuited completely. The Drevlock warlord roared in fury, his powerful form staggering backward. The warlord's last stand. The humans pressed their advantage. David, still dazed but recovering, pulled himself up and used the momentary distraction to lunge at the warlord's exposed flank. His fist hit the weak point in the armor. Jack's shard flared again, and the warlord's remaining energy systems collapsed. With a final scream, the massive creature fell to his knees. His once imposing figure crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The yard was silent. Jack exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. But the victory felt hollow. The battle wasn't over yet. The price of victory. As the humans caught their breath, the distant wail of alarms signaled the arrival of more Drevlock soldiers. They had only moments before the entire compound would be swarming with enemies. "We need to move," David said, his voice shaky but urgent. "Now." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the transport bay. He could see the ramp still lowered, the ship waiting for them, but it wouldn't be for long. They sprinted toward the ship, moving faster than they ever had before. Ben reached the ramp first, pulling himself up. "It's open. Get in here." Michael and David followed closely behind, with Jack bringing up the rear. But just as he stepped onto the ramp, a Drevlock blast hit the ground next to him, sending a shockwave through the air. The ramp slammed shut, and the ship's engines roared to life. Jack barely made it inside as the ship's hull shuddered from a direct hit. A brief moment of peace. The humans stumbled to their feet, finally catching their breath. The ship's interior was surprisingly spacious, filled with advanced technology and weapons they could barely comprehend. Jack looked around at his team. David, Michael, and Ben were alive, barely. Their clothes were torn, their bodies covered in cuts and bruises, but they were here. They were alive. For the first time, Jack allowed himself a small breath of relief. They were getting out. But just as quickly as the peace settled, the ship's communications console flickered on. A deep, distorted voice crackled over the speakers. "You may have won this battle, but you won't win the war." It was General Kraith, the Drevlock leader. His voice was calm, even though the warning was unmistakable. "You have no idea what you've unleashed. You will regret this." Jack's blood ran cold. The ship lurched forward as the engines roared to life, but Jack could already feel the tension in the air. The Drevlock ships were closing in fast, too fast. The atmosphere inside the transport was tense, each breath heavier than the last. The communications console crackled again, the distorted voice of General Kraith sending a chill down Jack's spine. "I warned you," Kraith's voice boomed. "You have no idea what kind of power you've just unlocked. You'll never escape, and the entire galaxy will learn to fear the Drevlock." The transmission cut off, leaving a silence so thick it almost felt suffocating. The pursuit. Jack, David, Michael, and Ben stood by the control panel, eyes locked on the rapidly approaching Drevlock warships. They had a mere few minutes before the Drevlock launched their attack. "We need to break free of their pursuit," Jack said, voice strained. He grabbed the control panel and slammed his fist down, activating the ship's emergency thrusters. The transport shot forward, its engines screaming in protest. The Drevlock ships, however, were not far behind, gaining on them with alarming speed. Ben cursed. "This isn't going to be enough. They're too fast." David moved toward the navigation console, fingers flying over the controls. "I'm trying to override the systems," he said. "But I need a few more seconds." "Give us those seconds," Jack said through gritted teeth. "We don't have any more to spare." Desperation. The Drevlock warships fired, plasma cannons streaked across the dark sky, narrowly missing their ship. The force of the blasts rocked their transport, knocking them all off balance. "Brace for impact!" David shouted, struggling to stay on his feet as the ship swayed. Jack reached for the shard in his pocket. The golden glow pulsed softly, almost in response to the chaos unfolding around them. It had been their weapon, their key to survival, but now, in this moment of desperation, Jack realized that it wasn't enough. The Drevlock were relentless. They had underestimated humanity, but they were coming back with everything they had. Jack felt the weight of the weapon in his hand. They had to do something they hadn't considered before. "We have to use the weapon," Jack said suddenly, his voice low but determined. David looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What? Are you crazy? We've only used it in small bursts, we don't know the full extent of its power." Jack nodded, his face grim. "We don't have a choice. If we don't do this now, they'll destroy us all." The decision. Jack moved toward the control panel and started rerouting the ship's energy grid, connecting it to the shard. His hands shook, but he kept his focus. He could feel the energy building, the ship vibrating as the power systems were drained into the shard. "It's ready," Jack said, his voice heavy with tension. "We have to release it, now." David grabbed his arm. "Are you sure?" Jack turned to face him, his eyes filled with resolve. "We have no other option." He pressed the activation switch. The shocking power. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the entire ship shuddered, and the shard in Jack's hand flared to life. The golden light surged through the ship, growing brighter and brighter until it felt as if the very air around them had fused with energy. The transport ship's engines powered up like never before, and the ship shot forward with such force that the Drevlock warships were momentarily left behind. But the energy wasn't just contained in the ship's engines. The power from the shard began to overwhelm everything, surging into the ship's weapon systems, amplifying them exponentially. A beam of raw energy, much larger than anything they had ever witnessed, erupted from the transport's front, slicing through the Drevlock warships like a hot knife through butter. The Drevlock ships, once formidable, were obliterated in an instant, their hulking forms torn apart by the weaponized energy. Jack stared, breathless. The sheer power was beyond anything they had imagined, and it was just the beginning. Aftermath. As the last of the Drevlock warships disintegrated into space debris, Jack sank into the seat, overwhelmed by the force of what they had just unleashed. His heart still raced, but the battle was far from over. "We did it," Ben whispered. "We actually did it." Michael was silent, his face pale. "This power, he trailed off, unable to find the right words. David, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, spoke up. "We don't control it. It controls us now." Jack stood up, walking toward the viewport, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The Drevlock had been defeated, but they had unlocked something far more dangerous than they had ever intended. "What if we can't control it?" David asked softly. Jack swallowed hard. "Then we'll make sure it controls only our enemies." The message that flashed across the communication console sent a cold shiver down Jack's spine. The voice, deep and resonant, was not one he had heard before. It was more authoritative, more menacing, and it carried a weight of knowledge that made Jack's blood run cold. "You have no idea what you've just started. The galaxy will tremble under the weight of your actions." The message ended abruptly, leaving a lingering silence in the air. Jack and his crew exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling the growing sense of unease that seemed to settle over them like a dark cloud. David, still recovering from the previous strain, moved slowly toward the console. "What do you think it means?" Jack clenched his fists, staring at the blank screen. "I don't know. But it doesn't sound like someone we can just ignore." "We've made enemies," Michael said, his voice thick with disbelief. Real enemies. Ones that could do more than just send a few warships after us. Ben's face paled. But we've destroyed their fleet. What could be worse than that? Jack was silent for a moment, the weight of their victory, and the potential consequences, settling heavily on his shoulders. The weapon they had discovered, the one they had turned into their ultimate defense, had not only saved them but attracted the attention of something far more dangerous than the Drevlock. The history of the Shard. David stood up straighter, his brow furrowing as he replayed the message in his mind. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "This shard, this material, it's more than just a weapon. It's ancient." The room fell silent as the others processed what David had just said. David continued, his voice quieter now. "I've been studying it since we found it. It reacts to energy, yes, but it also remembers energy. It stores information. The more we use it, the more it seems to learn about its surroundings. It's almost like it's alive." Jack's stomach twisted. "Are you saying that this isn't just something the Drevlock discovered by accident?" David nodded. "Exactly. It was created, by a race far older than the Drevlock, a race that was destroyed by their own technology. This shard was left behind, buried in the debris of a war so devastating that even the survivors forgot about it." Ben rubbed his eyes. "You're saying we've stumbled onto something that wiped out an entire species?" David looked up, his eyes wide with realization. "Yes. And the ones who created this technology aren't just going to let us walk away with it. They've been watching us. And they've been waiting for someone to rediscover what they lost." A new enemy revealed. The ship's hull vibrated as they passed through a dense asteroid field, each rock a potential hazard. But Jack barely noticed. His mind was racing. They had just unlocked a weapon powerful enough to level entire fleets, and now they were being hunted by the very beings who had once wielded it. The communication console crackled again, this time with a sharp, metallic voice. "You think you can control it. You think you can use it as your weapon. But you are only the next step in a long-forgotten cycle. We are the architects of your fate." The words hit Jack like a blow. "Who are you?" he demanded, leaning forward, his voice full of defiance. "Who's doing this?" There was a long pause. Then the voice returned, calm but chilling. "We are the Orcs, and we've been waiting for the humans to awaken what was ours." The Orcs, a lost civilization. Jack's mind raced. The name Orcs was unfamiliar, but David's face went pale, and his eyes widened in realization. "They were a species unlike any other," David murmured. "They existed millennia ago, long before the Drevlock, long before humanity. Their technology, this shard, it was their crowning achievement. But they didn't control it. They lost themselves to it." "Lost themselves?" Michael asked. David nodded grimly. "The Orcs created a technology so powerful that it could rewrite the very fabric of reality. They used it to conquer worlds, destroy entire civilizations. But eventually, they became consumed by their own power. They were erased from history." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "And now they're coming back for the shard?" David sighed. "Not just the shard. They're coming for us, because they believe humanity is the next step in their destructive cycle. We found their power, and now we've become part of their twisted plan." The choice. The ship shook violently as another energy pulse struck the hull. The Drevlock warships had not been the only threat, they were now dealing with the Orcs, who had been silently tracking their every move. The crew scrambled to the control panels, trying to keep the ship steady. But Jack knew the truth now, they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The Orcs wouldn't stop until they had destroyed humanity for daring to wield their creation. "We need to make a choice," Jack said, his voice cutting through the panic. "We either continue this path, knowing what we're facing, or we destroy the shard and everything it represents, and hope they never find us. David turned to face him. And what if the Orcs don't let us destroy it? Jack didn't have an answer. The weapon was far too powerful, and the Orcs were far too dangerous. But one thing was clear, the universe would never be the same again. The Orcs' voice had faded, but the weight of their words still echoed in the cabin, filling the air with an unbearable tension. Jack stood frozen, staring at the communication console, his mind racing with a dozen different thoughts. The universe had just shifted beneath them, and he knew there was no going back. The Orcs weren't just after the shard. They wanted to control humanity, shape its destiny, and perhaps erase them entirely. Jack glanced at his crew, each of them bruised, exhausted, and haunted by the immense responsibility they now carried. David, Ben, and Michael were still struggling to comprehend the reality of their situation, their faces drawn tight with fear and disbelief. Jack exhaled slowly. We've been running from them. We've been fighting to survive. But it's time to stop running. The true power of choice. The ship continued to rattle under the pressure of the Orcs' pursuit, the hull groaning as their weapons targeted the transport. Jack looked out the viewport, watching the distant stars blur into streaks of light as they accelerated into deep space. Their chances of outrunning the Orcs seemed slim, but Jack knew they couldn't just keep running forever. "We can't keep going like this," Michael said quietly, his voice cracking. "We're running out of time." Ben, who had been silent until now, stood up and walked over to the control panel. He placed his hand on the console. "We don't have to keep running. We can fight back. The shard, it's the only thing that's kept us alive this long." Jack turned to him, his voice firm. "You're right. But we can't just fight them. The power we're dealing with, it's too dangerous. We need to make a choice, and this time, it's going to be our choice, not theirs." David, still processing everything, looked at Jack with a mixture of concern and understanding. "What do you mean?" Jack took a deep breath. "We've been using the shard to fight back, but it's not just a weapon. It's something alive. It reacts to us. It amplifies whatever we feel. That's why the Orcs are after it, they know we're the next step in its cycle. If we don't control it, we're going to be consumed by it." The path forward. There was a long silence as the crew processed what Jack had said. For a moment, it seemed like the universe had stopped spinning, leaving only the hum of the ship and the sound of their breathing. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He had no easy answers, no guarantees that their next move wouldn't destroy them. "We can use it to fight back," Jack continued, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. "But only if we know when to stop. If we let it consume us like it did with the Orcs, we'll become the monsters they feared. It's not about the weapon, it's about our choice." David's voice was soft, but there was a hard edge to it. "And if we don't fight, what happens then? We just let the Orcs take us down without a fight?" Jack nodded. "We choose how we fight. And we choose not to let it break us." Ben, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward. "Then let's stop running. Let's take the fight to them. But we do it on our terms." Michael gave a reluctant nod. "I'm with you." Jack felt a surge of hope. They were all in this together, and that's what had gotten them this far. It wasn't just the weapon, it was their will to survive, their ability to make a choice when everything seemed impossible. The final battle. They didn't wait. They couldn't afford to. The Orcs were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jack activated the ship's engines and set course for the nearest Orcs-controlled planet, a desolate world where the Orcs were rumored to be hiding. The journey would take days. But in that time, they began preparing. David and Ben worked together, recalculating the ship's power systems, ensuring they could amplify the shard without destroying themselves. Jack spent hours meditating, trying to center his mind, feeling the energy of the shard without letting it overwhelm him. The crew was tense, but they worked together, knowing this was their only chance. The Orcs confrontation. When they finally arrived, the Orcs ships were waiting. But the humans were ready this time. Jack and his crew had chosen to face them, not as victims, but as warriors, armed with the shard and the strength of their own will. The battle was intense. The Orcs ships fired at them with devastating power, but the shard's energy surged, deflecting and redirecting their weapons with blinding intensity. Jack could feel the shard, alive in his hands, amplifying his thoughts, his fury, and his desire to protect those he loved. But Jack kept control. He focused on the mission, on the people who were counting on him, and the strength that humanity had shown time and time again. They weren't going to let the Orcs decide their fate. With one final push, Jack activated the shard at full power, directing the energy not to destroy, but to disable the Orcs' fleet's weapon systems. The Orcs' ships began to fall, their power cut off, their firepower useless. A new beginning. When the dust settled, Jack stood at the console, staring at the destroyed Orcs' fleet. The battle was over. They had won, not through sheer destruction, but through control, intelligence, and resilience. They had shown that strength wasn't about power, it was about choosing how to wield it. David walked over, clapping Jack on the back. "We did it." Jack nodded, his eyes tired but filled with determination. "We did it because we made a choice. We didn't let the weapon control us. We controlled it." The ship slowly turned, heading back into deep space. There would be more battles ahead, but Jack knew that humanity had just learned the greatest lesson of all. The true power lies in the choices we make.